Apologies. This is a day when technology doesn't like me, but I will try to ingratiate myself and stay for the duration of the event. So hello and welcome everyone, and especially warm welcome to our special guest tonight, Dr. Sylvia Hamilton. I am Dorota Glowacka. I'm a professor at the University of King's College in Chibuktuk, Halifax. I will be the moderator at tonight's event, and to a modest degree, I'll be also a participant. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that this event is taking place in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties by which all of us on this land today are obligated. And I would like to extend our gratitude to the ancestors of this land, as well as to the ancestors of the lands where you may be sitting in front of your computers right now. This event is brought to you by the Counter-Memory Activism Research Group. We are an interdisciplinary research creation project between artists, museologists, curators, and scholars of Holocaust and genocide and memory studies. This project explores current questions and historical context of what we call memory activism. We look at themes such as collective memory and the commemoration of heritage and of difficult histories. This research project has been funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada's Insight Development Grant, and it is a partnership between the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design and the University of King's College. Before I introduce tonight's guest, let me explain how this will work. It will begin with a 15-minute, after my introduction, we will have a 15-minute presentation by Dr. Sylvia Hamilton, and it will be followed by more or less 15 minutes of conversation between Dr. Hamilton and myself. And then no later than 8 p.m., we will open it to questions from the floor. We will conclude at around 8:30. So you will be able to type your questions in the Q&A chat feature, so that those questions will only be visible to the moderator, that is myself. I will read the questions to the speaker, and I will identify the person who asked the question with the first name. Unless you specifically prefer that I don't, then perhaps you can indicate it in the chat. And also, please put our next event on the calendar. And sadly, this will be the last in this amazing speaker series. On Wednesday, May the 5th at 7 p.m. Atlantic Daytime, we will be hosting Veronica Tello. Tello is a Chilean-Australian art historian who is based at a University of New South Wales Art and Design in Sydney, Australia. She's known for her work on transnational queer networks and queer and migratory archives in Australia and Latin America, especially. And she is the author of Counter-Memorial Aesthetics, Refugee Histories, and the Politics of Contemporary Art. And we hope to see you all again. And now I am really honored to introduce tonight's guest. Dr. Sylvia Hamilton is a Nova Scotian filmmaker, writer, multimedia artist known for her award-winning documentary films, but also for her publications, presentations, extensive volunteer work with artistic, social, and cultural organizations, both locally and at national levels. Her films include, among others, Black Mother, Black Daughter, which came out in 1989, Speak It, From the Heart of Black Nova Scotia, 1992, Portia White, Think on Me, in 2000, and The Little Black Schoolhouse, 2007. All of those films received numerous awards. I just mentioned a few: a Gemini Award, Progress Women of Excellence Award for Art and Culture. the CBC Television Pioneer Award, the Portia White Prize, and so forth. Dr. Hamilton is also the recipient of several honorary degrees and of the 2019 Governor General's History Award. Her films have been broadcast on television. They have been screened at national and international festivals. And let me also mention Dr. Hamilton's poetry collection, which came out in 2014, and I alone escaped to tell you. I cannot resist. That collection was a finalist for several awards as well. And then the year before, in 2013, that was when the exhibition of Dr. Hamilton's multimedia art installation opened at Dalhousie Art Gallery. It was entitled Excavation, a Site of Memory. And then in various iterations, it's been shown in other galleries and museums in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, and Quebec. And importantly, one of those adaptations titled Here We Are Here gave its name to the 2018 Royal Ontario Museum's national group exhibition titled Here We Are Here, Black Canadian Contemporary Art. And then in 2019, that exhibition traveled from Ontario and was shown at Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. So those of us in Halifax, many of us, I'm sure, saw that exhibit. Let me just add that very importantly in the academic context in which this speaker series takes place, Dr. Hamilton is also an educator and a beloved teacher. She taught in the States. She taught at the University of West Indies in Kingston, Jamaica. She held nonsense chair in women's studies at Mount Saint Vincent University in Halifax. And for many years, she was Rogers Chair in Communications in the School of Journalism at the University of King's College, where I had the privilege and an enormous pleasure to work with her and have her as my colleague and often also as my mentor. After her retirement from the University of King's College in 2020, King's launched 5 annual awards in her name for African Canadian students. So although Dr. Hamilton has received numerous recognitions and honors, they do not convey the true extent and true importance of the immense, tangible, and truly transformative impact of her work in Nova Scotia, in Canada, in the US, and beyond. And I am thrilled to welcome Sylvia Hamilton.
Wow, thank you, Dorota. That was amazing. And it's funny because we talked about really having a short intro, but I'm grateful to you and thank you for your generosity in reminding me of the kinds of things I've been working on and our relationship as colleagues and friends. I really appreciate the invitation to speak with you all today, and I thank the organizers of this very, very important memory project for the invitation. I will speak for a few moments, and as part of my talk, I want to read a couple of poems, and all of this is by way of context for the conversations that Dorota and I will have. And I'm going to now share my screen. Okay, is it there? Okay. Okay. I am constantly preoccupied with 3 primary interlocking themes: history, oral and written, memory, and location, space, and place. These recurring themes are embedded in my work, my films, my installations, my poetry, my essays, talks, teaching, image making. I'm grounded by the words of James Baldwin about history, and he said, and I quote, "If history were past, history wouldn't matter. History is present, the present. You and I are history. We carry our history. We act our history. My work is how I act my history. When I consider textual history, it is as much what is not written as what is, and how I reinterpret and repurpose it. This is especially true for the photographic image, both still and moving. Both figure prominently in my films and in my installations. Next slide. The work that I create has to do its own work out there in the world. The documentaries travel beyond me to places I don't know about. They meet people I've never met. Maybe I won't meet them. They venture further than many of the people featured in the films have. And sometimes I hear back, sometimes not. The work has to be confident in itself to exist out there in the world without me. So far, it's not complaining too much. It's out there going it alone. My work asks some fundamental questions about who we are in this country and how the telling of our stories disrupt the comfortable narrative of Canada. It says here, look at us. Who do you see? It also asks, what do we know about us? What do we know about each other? It defies dominant attempts at erasure. In the lives, in the stories, the material culture, the oratory, it says, we have long memories. We defy anyone who says we don't belong here because we've been here for centuries. It says, I dare you to say we do not exist or our existence has no meaning, does not matter. In many ways, my work carries on its own internal conversation with interrelated references. There's a sibling relationship between Speak It from the Heart of Black Nova Scotia and the Little Black Schoolhouse. Both, in an underlying way, question our notion of democracy and its benefits, one of which is supposed to be an equitable and just education. My most recent work, Excavation, a Site of Memory, which Dorota kindly referenced in her introduction, which began in 2013, it's an organic, multimedia, multi-year installation that allowed for a more directly personal exploration of the themes I mentioned earlier: memory, history, location, place, space. It drew on my documentary practice and my writing to concretize these themes in the temporal spaces of art galleries and museums. I've installed 5 solo shows and 3 iterations as part of the group exhibition organized by the Royal Ontario Museum. Who were my ancestors and the ancestors of people who looked like me? What did they look like? What did their voices sound like when they spoke, when they sang, when they cried? The timbre, the tone, and pitch of their voices. My practice is informed by my context, history, backstory, and experiences in the world. The Black refugee survivors of the War of 1812 were my ancestors. The conditions they faced when they arrived in Nova Scotia were horrendous. They were housed in a British-owned and built stone prison at Melville Island in Halifax's northwest arm. It's the current site of the Armdale Yacht Squadron. They faced disease, the cold, hunger, and indifference. It would be another 22 years before slavery was abolished in British colonies such as Canada. Yet, we live in its continuing shadow. Had these ancestors not been imaginative, creative, and determined, they would never have survived. I would not exist. They were the original Afro-futurists, Black refugee futurists. I called them into the rooms with me when I created Excavation. I am who they imagined. My work is also guided by the words of literary giant and intellectual Toni Morrison. Here is what she said about her job as a writer, and I quote, "For me, a writer in the last quarter of the 20th century, not much more than 100 years after emancipation, a writer who is Black and a woman, the exercise is different. My job becomes how to rip that veil drawn over proceedings too terrible to relate. The exercise is also critical for any person who is Black or who belongs to any marginalized category, for historically, we were seldom invited to participate in the discourse, even when we were its topic. I know what my work must do." My early oral history research and the exploration of the archive, public and private community-based, formed the scaffolding, the spine, the roadmap for my subsequent work. It seeded my imagination. The results came years later in my films, essays, poetry presentations, installations. Excavation evolves and changes as it is hosted by different institutions. The assortment of objects arranged for display creates a sensory environment, a memory chamber for remembering and imagining. I am interested in how the meaning of objects, documents, and a plethora of archival material can change and offer alternate meanings depending on their position, their placement, their location, and how they may be juxtaposed to place them in conversation with other artifacts and critically with the institutions hosting the installation. Several fundamental questions propel my work. Whose history? Whose memory is acknowledged? Whose archive is considered valuable, worthy? By whom? What do we remember? What remains? What has been rendered invisible? What do we really know about the presence of Black African people in this particular Atlantic place? In the places across this country we call Canada. My work thinks about why I am here. How did I get here? And what do I do while I'm here? Water is central to our story. My ancestors were bold freedom runners. They were courageous, tenacious, willful. In this present moment, I think about the many people around the world who take fate into their own hands when they board rickety rafts, unsafe rubber zodiacs, or other unseaworthy vessels in their quest to find the elusive aspiration we name freedom. They do so armed only with an uncertain promise, but no guarantee of a life without fear, a life they hope will be filled with peace. In my mind's eye, I juxtapose images of tall sailing ships stacked with kidnapped Africans, chained, cutting through the wild Atlantic, or the frigates sailing north from New York after the War of 1812, transporting self-liberated Africans to Nova Scotia. Then vessels sailing from Nova Scotia south to the Caribbean. They're stocked with saltfish, timber, enslaved Africans. I'll close with two poems. And these poems are come from And I Alone Escaped to Tell You, and they've also moved from the poetry book onto the walls of the galleries. The passage. We had our own names, a past, a present. We worked, we loved, sang songs to the wind, prayed to our gods. We did not know the future would not be ours. We fought, and we fought. And when we were spent, terrors like a buzz of locusts invaded our sleep. Night terrors not chased away by the morning sun, night terrors stalking us. And when we went crazy with pain, sinking into the dank water, blood rushing from the hole in our chests, still the terrors danced on our bodies, waiting to overtake the next ones, shackled below on the Severn in full sail behind us. The sons of darkness stole our children's tomorrow. Melville Island, 1814. Silenced by the snow, they wondered if even God had finally forsaken them. Home, a stone prison. Temporary, officials say. We used to temporary. Come in from the fields one day to find out we've been up and sold. We invented temporary. When they line us up after they drag us off them waterbeds of death, we ready for a new kind of temporary. Nova scarcity. Seed potatoes, turnip, tobacco, good crop in the fall. Now all froze to the floor. And if we still here in spring, we try again. Thank you for listening and your attention.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Thank you. As a matter of fact, just last Sunday, I was hiking to the Dead Man's Island, and I looked across the water at Melville's Island, and I remembered your poem. And at that point, I was not seeing the posh yacht club. I was seeing literally what you are writing about in your book. So I thank you for reading that poem. Many questions come to my mind simultaneously, but maybe I will take a cue from what I see in the background behind you and ask you about the importance of names in your work, because the voices in all of your work, they don't speak just from somewhere in history, but they always speak from places and specific geographical locations that you take such care to name. And the individuals are not just Black Canadians, but they all have names. And again, you are so meticulous in recovering the names and preserving the names. And that, I understand, is the ledger with 3,000 names of African Canadians, of Africans who came here for centuries. And that kind of is this force of resistance against the anonymity of history. And as a matter of fact, as you recently told me, one of your most recent works is a permanent installation at the Idea Building for the School of Engineering and Architecture, which is called Here We Are Here Naming Names. So why is it so important to continuously not just discover those names, but repeat and recite them over and over again?
Thank you for that question. It's about visibility, primarily, that I wanted to, and I want to ensure that these ancestors, the people who are responsible for my being here and many African Nova Scotians, that they're not lost, they're not forgotten. They were individuals, and their humanity is important to remember. And because of the terror of the transatlantic slave trade and the rendering of people invisible and as if they were not human, for me, it's a question of recovery and doing whatever I can to help to give that humanity back in these moments, in the moments of naming the names, pulling those names out of the historical record and giving them prominence, and in many ways concretizing their presence. So the idea of the naming name scrolls, which are in my background, I think about each one of those names. That's an individual person. And in cases where I might not have had a name, where in the historical record it might have said 7 slaves, or 5 servants. They were individuals, even though they were grouped as 5 or 7. Those were individuals, and for me, it was important to also recognize and concretize their presence in the work.
Thank you. It's so powerful, and it also reminds me that uh, for Holocaust commemoration ceremonies, and I'm a Holocaust scholar, we always begin with reciting the names, and sometimes we just recite the names for an hour, and we begin by saying for every person there is a name. And it's just, that there is the recitation of the name is such a powerful, monument that I think is more kind of endurable than the ones made of bronze, if you wish. So,
Also, if I might add as well, it's part of an African Baptist tradition here in Nova Scotia, where when I was young and we would go to a particular church service, those people who would have transitioned, would have passed during the year, their names were called were called out, and there would be a roll call service, and their names were recorded. So again, they were not forgotten. And in the African Baptist minutes from 100 years ago, each church would make a record of those individuals who would have died in the year from the time when the association might have happened. So it is also the naming of names, the roll call, the calling out people's names when they've passed is part of that Baptist, that African Black Baptist tradition here in Nova Scotia. And again, it's a way for me to honor and recognize that it's not something new. It's something that people have done over generations so that they do not forget. Even if the broader public, the broader society may have tried to erase, ignore within the communities, that is not the case. People have honored and paid tribute to their own.
so, so perhaps I will now ask. I think what's behind you are 3,000 names, but how do you find those names? And what I want to ask, I'm really struck by what I call a kind of archaeological metaphor in your work. Um, and then your exhibition is called Excavation. And when you describe your work, you speak of like mining the archive and digging into the layers of official history and extracting, exploring what has been buried. So that's why I'm kind of thinking of you as a very non-traditional archaeologist. And how to put it, like Western archaeologists were actually complicit in the colonial project. And your work seems to be a kind of counter archaeological project where everything you find, every name, every object is a kind of a force of resistance. A photograph or hairbrush suddenly becomes this active object of resistance to official archaeologists. So would you agree that in a way you are a kind of, I don't know, counter archaeologist, or I'm thinking archaeologist of this futurist imagination?
Well, I think it is perhaps that is an interesting metaphor, an interesting way to look at it. And yes, I think for me it is about that act of uncovering what is there. It's not to make assumptions that it doesn't exist. It's this notion that, oh, just because I don't know something doesn't mean that something doesn't exist. And to your question about the names on the scrolls come from several historical documents.
Mm-hmm.
One of the documents is what's called Carlton's Book of Negroes, and it is the list of Black people who came as part of the Loyalist migration after the American Revolution. Those enslaved Africans who liberated themselves to fight with the British. They were promised freedom. And so when the American Revolution was over, they congregated mostly in New York, and their names were recorded in this book. Governor Carlton had their names recorded. And so that book, a copy of it is in the archives, a copy is now online. And so I pulled names, as many names as I could find out of that book. Within another text called The Slave in Canada that was published in about 1899 by Watson Smith, who was a provincial archivist. Every reference to a slave, I pulled those names from that book. And then from the Halifax list of the Black refugee survivors from the War of 1812. So I pulled those names from those historical documents. So that's the origin of those particular names. And to the point of photographs and uncovering the digging, it's part of, I think, my idea that if I can uncover that material, if I can uncover those things and then render it visible, concretize it in some way, then especially the younger generation may have an opportunity to understand what this history is and how long the history is. And I mentioned as well the juxtaposition of what I might see in an official archive with the kinds of things that I might have in my own archive or that I might find within Black community organizations. So for me, a lot of it is that juxtaposition. It's finding material. It's thinking about objects having their own story, their own history, and how do we uncover that? How do we think about that? And that's where the imagination then take flight.
Great. Well, I guess that's why I was sort of trying to find a word and say you are like a counter archaeologist or counter archivist or archivist. And if I may quickly say, I recall when my visit in the Smithsonian Museum of African American Culture and History several years ago. And I was getting a tour with a curator who was telling me, oh, you in Canada, you were so lucky, you did not have slavery. And the next day I came back with your book of poems and also a copy of Amani Whitfield's book about North to Bondage to kind of counteract, that official narrative with your counter narrative. This is, I think, where both imagination and this kind of relentless, meticulous undermining comes in.
Well, it is, I think, we have a number of historians who are doing really important work in this area, and Amani Whitfield is one of them. I think that the kind of the generalized Canadian narrative has said for years that slavery did not exist in Canada. And so, in spite of the fact that the records are there, the information is there. However, white historians primarily have ignored it, have not thought that it was relevant. The other argument sometimes is, well, there weren't that many, as if the numbers made any difference. Whether you've got 15 people who were enslaved or 5,000, the fact that you were enslaving human beings is the question. And so I think it is very difficult often for many white Canadians to actually come to grips and grapple with the fact that, yes, this country here in this province engaged in, the transatlantic slave trade. Governors, ministers, prominent judges. That information is there and it's been hidden. And again, thanks to the diligent work of many scholars, that is now coming to the fore. And so the denial, that dance, what I call the dance of denial, has to stop, because the evidence is there, because the legacy of it is still with us. The traces, the shadow, the sediment of those attitudes that went along with the enslavement of people of African descent is still with us today.
Absolutely, and that work has been crucial, and so was your help in the inquiry into connections with slavery that we are currently undertaking at King's and Dalhousie. Thank you. I wonder if I can ask about something else that has always also been going through my mind. Um, I was just reading something that you wrote, and in two places you were saying that you are recovering the history of Black people, and then you add especially Black women. And indeed, you know, it's Black mother, Black daughter. And there is the film on Portia White, all these incredible, influential, powerful Black women. And I have to say, Portia White is one of my favorite films of all times. I've seen it many times. So I wanted you to ask about why it's perhaps especially important to talk and think and write the history of women, and whether you are thinking in terms of kind of gender inflected intersectional analysis when you write and work and show the images of Black women.
When I grew up, the people who were very influential to me were women in the Black community. They were at the core of so much of the work that went on in community. And, you know, that work wasn't, in my mind, recognized. And so that became one of the reasons why my first film, Black Mother, Black Daughter, was I made. But I think, you know, and after that, my goal was really to look at the lives of women and the kind of work that they were doing, and you know, within the society that both was ruled through white patriarchy, white supremacy, but also the kind of racism that Black women would face. So it's kind of back in the 70s, the language was triple jeopardy, you know, or double jeopardy, that you were both Black and female, and then, you know, you were poor, other kinds of things happening to you. So, you know, the diligence with which the Black women that I knew lived their lives and did what they did, to me was really quite remarkable, and I felt needed to have exploration. So my writing about those women, the women that I wrote about in my master's thesis, who were activists and advocates within the Baptist Church, took on the question of violence against women, a film I made in the 90s around violence against women in the Black community. They were very courageous to uncover these kinds of stories and to speak publicly about the gender-based violence, the sexualized violence that they were experiencing. And then people like women like Portia White or Dr. Carrie Best, remarkable women whose lives were really worthy of investigation and celebration. And so, you know, complex lives as well. And so for me, to be able to find a way to tell their stories, or to bring those stories into the public sphere was really important.
You talk about violence, you talk about objectification, you know, chattel, slavery, horrific incidents, yet you create art that is beautiful. And I think that is actually, I'm quoting or thinking about something you wrote, that you want to show beauty amongst all this ugliness and horror, and to kind of like transvalue that which in kind of traditional Western aesthetics was ugly and denigrated and small and not worthy of even looking at, let alone admire, and make it into something gorgeous and beautiful. So again, I think I want to ask about that. I think deliberate different aesthetics in your work that makes all these women so beautiful.
In amongst the kind of experiences women have had, they've always found an opportunity to laugh, an opportunity to look at themselves and to adorn themselves. And one of the iterations of the exhibition that I did in at the Thames Gallery in Ontario, that was a spot where I found these lovely combs, hair combs, and mirrors that women in the community there had used over many years. And to me, it was a sign that they had a good sense of themselves in spite of what the broader society might be saying to them of who they were, and that they were not beautiful or ugly or deserving attention. They themselves knew that that was not the case. And so it was a way for them to adorn, and that is part of the what's internal to the women that I was writing about, or whose stories I was trying to tell. And in spite of the racism, in spite of all of these kinds of things, the laughter, the joy, the excitement, the diligence, the resilience, that's all part of the complexity of the Black experience, the Black female experience. And so, and for me, it's important that be acknowledged, that we're not, and Black women or Black people are not reduced to the problem. I call it the sociology, where it's always the problem people. That's not the case. And that's not, we don't live our lives in that way. So the idea of thinking about beauty, finding those ways to incorporate that in the work is fundamental, is important.
I also have a sense that against a kind of story that would in a way reduce these women to the victims of history, you are like really granting them agency. You are sort of showing them like resisting with like the force of the laughter and like the force of like things they created, be it like combs or quilts or ribbons. So I think this kind of granting of agency is really important in your work. Like you are kind of enabling these subjects of history in the past to be sort of active and in the present.
Well, there's one of the items that I think in one of my slides, you'll see there's the barrel, and it has red ribbon and hair locks, my old locks. And I was inspired to use that in the show because there was a freedom runner named Thursday, and the description of her had her having a red ribbon. And that small detail was really important to me because that told me something about her. It told me something about her desire to adorn. It told me something about her desire to be free, to be her own person. And that's why she ran. That's why she took her own freedom. And when I look at some of those old ads for the women especially, and knowing that that's what they were doing, they were not simply taking the abuse. I mean, they took every chance they could to run, and they would take extra clothes with them. And what they had on was really important. So for me, thinking about beauty, thinking about how Black women have over generations found those ways to find joy within their lives. And if you go into Black churches in Nova Scotia, on a Sunday, or if you go to the African United Baptist Association in August, the women are so beautiful. The hats, the style, the dress, it's phenomenal. And it's inspiring. And so for me, that's an important element around how people self-define and defy the broader societal stereotypes and naming. So it is the agency, it is self-definition.
Great. Suddenly a very different question occurred to me because I was struck by one of the photographs that you just showed. But by the way, I just have to say that the barrel with the red ribbon, because I was lucky to see your exhibit at Dalhousie in 2013. And that image, that just really stuck in my head. It was so powerful.
And And maybe I could just interject for a moment because I didn't explain what
Mhm.
barrels were about.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Yes.
you know
Mhm.
that the barrels represent they were called hogshead back in the day, and they were storage units, and there were Black girls sold on Halifax waterfront along with barrels of rum and sugar. And
Mhm.
so what I was doing there was an equivalency. If I had been 14 years old, I was equivalent to one of those barrels because they were sold as property, they were sold as physical objects along with hogshead of rum and sugar. So the idea of placing those barrels within the exhibition was again a way to concretize what that actually meant, to think about a person, a Black person, a Black young girl as property,
Mhm.
as a barrel, as an object.
Which perhaps makes your attempt to grant them agency against that former status as, chattel and objects even more important. I wonder if you mind a very different question. It occurred to me when you showed the photograph of African Nova Scotian women making baskets. And I was suddenly reminded of a presentation we had last month with Kathy Martin. And her recent project is the basket maker. So I'm suddenly thinking of these two images, both of which are so powerfully anti-colonial. And I'm kind of trying to imagine in what way your work, even if it is so specific, uh, and so specifically about Black Nova Scotians, also intersects with the violent history of the Mi'kmaq here. I'm also imagining in my head a kind of film co-directed by Sylvia Hamilton and Kathy Martin that would speak to these issues.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Kath and I have talked about that. So
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Well, we've talked
Of
about. I mean, there were both. There's an image from I think the Nova Scotia. It's one that I found at the Nova Scotia Museum, where there are Mi'kmaq women and Black women both selling baskets at the
mm,
Halifax market.
oh,
So that's not untoward. Also, I know Mrs. Edith Clayton, who's pictured in whose photograph was at the beginning, and that's a still from Black Mother, Black Daughter, where there was a basket making session at her house. She did tell me that she often would purchase dyes from Mi'kmaq women because they had certain kinds of dyes that she would like to use in some of her baskets. So there was a connection. These women were both selling baskets at the market, different styles of basket, different types of baskets, but clearly that material culture, that tradition of the basket being the carrier of objects, but also objects of beauty.
thank you. I am glancing at the clock and the time is running away from me. We have about a minute or two. So perhaps I will just ask a very general question, because you often speak of your work as a form of bearing witness, that you think of yourself as a witness to history and in a way not exactly spokesperson, but a medium through which the voices of the past speak. And I wonder what those voices uh, say to, the settler community at large. That's one. What do these voices say to people like me? I'm an immigrant to Nova Scotia. What do these voices say to the new Black diaspora, like people who come from Africa, often from war zones and places of conflict? How can we listen and benefit from your work so that we become witnesses in our turn?
Well, that's I wouldn't want to presume what the voices might say. I think that
Or how can we
I
listen?
can imagine. I can imagine that the idea of finding those moments for conversation, finding
Mhm.
those moments to listen to each other, and to learn from each other is perhaps a comment, an idea that might flow from history. Because unless we really take that time to learn and to listen and to think about and to question what we've been told before, and to find out, what really is the truth. People have come here and believe that there might not be any Black people here, or that everything was fine, and there was no slavery, but that's not the case. So the idea of collectively sitting down and trying to find ways to think together about the difficulties that we all face in this society right now, and what are the ways collectively we can begin picking away at the various problems that we all have. The environment, hunger, why do we still have food banks that are needing, donations every year, all the time? The poverty, the young children who are going without food, issues of violence against women. We need collectively to think about all of those issues, and no one organization, no one set of people can solve them separately. So in order to do that, I think it's important to be able to sit and learn from each other, learn about that history, learn what can we learn from history, what are the lessons that we can pull from the past and apply now, and then how do we go together towards that future. I think the other main thing is about not making assumptions about each other. There are a lot of assumptions that we might make. So rather than making assumptions, perhaps ask those questions. And it might seem silly, or you might think it's a stupid question, but the only way we really can learn from and about each other is really to begin asking those questions, and to do a lot of self-education. The information, people are out there. It's there to begin.
Great. Thank you. But as we have seen, I think throughout this speaker series, art creates spaces and opportunities to have such a conversation. And it's too bad that it has to be on Zoom right now, but hopefully we will be able to go back to galleries, and these are just wonderful and welcoming and creative and imaginative spaces. I just want to go back to what you said about imagination, how it needs to be reignited in order to have these conversations. So thank you very much.
Exactly.
And hopefully this conversation will now continue through the chat. Let me just peek if there are perhaps questions coming already. I have a question. Let me just improve the technology here. I have a question from Carly. Hello, Carly. My Halifax role models, Dorota and Sylvia. Thank you so much. Oh, that is, thank you. Thank you so much for holding this event. It was so nice to see and hear you two again. Oh, this is just a comment and a hello. So it's lots of love to you from Carly. Thank you. Wonderful. I don't see any questions coming in quite yet. So maybe as people are typing in, because it takes time. Do you mind, Sylvia, if I read just one line from your book that I love so much and I think is so relevant? And hopefully we will see some questions. It's the poem that's called Excavation. And you say, I am not the navigator on this journey. I am more than a passenger, but not the captain, longing for that which is not, for what could have been, for that imagined place. It's beautiful.
Thank you. I think imagination is important, that we have to, and as I mentioned in my talk, when I think about, the early ancestors, not only my own, but ancestors of all of us, what they did and how they did what they did, they had to have great imaginations. And I know that the Black refugee survivors, the Black refugee futurists, really had to have some kind of amazing imagination, because otherwise, how could they have ever survived what they survived? And somehow, when we're young, that imagination blossoms and flourishes, and all kinds of things happen. But then as we get older, we're less likely to use our imagination. We kind of allow the rational side to always take over, and not to allow that imagination, those flights of imagination, to really think about, what could be. Because if you can't think about what might be, it's hard to plan. It's hard to plan to make that happen. So
Yeah, and that goes back to what you said, and like that, the last line of the book, I am who they imagined, so that kind of uh, uh, force of imagination that engendered you, and all of these generations to come.
yeah.
I let me just peek again. I have two questions. I have a question. I think it's from Saul and Angela. I'm very curious about your process of curation and how it informs both your installation and film work. How do you collaborate with the community to access these personal archives? How does mentorship work its way into your work and processes?
So the process of curation,
Yes.
and then
And that's both in installation, in your art installations, and in your film work. And then how do you collaborate with the community to have access to those personal archives? I seem like it's three questions in one, because the last one is also whether about mentorship and the role of mentorship in your work and in the process of creating your work.
okay, maybe maybe I can start with that one first. I always try on all of my projects, whatever the project is, to make way for a younger person to come aboard in some capacity, because I feel a responsibility to help others along. Like I've been helped along by producers Sheila McKenzie, who was at the film board years ago. In my community when I was young, there were elders or people who gave me a nudge, helped me to grow, and so I feel a responsibility that I need to do something similar. So on pretty much every film project I've done, I've had either an intern or a younger person who's come on in some way, so that I can share whatever I've learned with them. And with regard to the installation, similar kinds of efforts to bring on a young person in some capacity to help. And then beyond these formal things, I will, people will write to me, ask me for help on projects, letters of reference. So whenever that happens, I do it whenever I can. So I both formally mentor in terms of people coming onto my projects, and then informally, I constantly get letters asking for help on a film idea, or something that they're working on. And whenever I can, I'll provide whatever resources, other connections, that may help them. Regarding the process of curation, and with the films particularly, over the years I've developed relationships with people in different communities, and one of my one of my goals is always to think about reciprocity. How, if I'm going to ask someone to be in a film, they need to know what I'm planning to do with that film. They also need to know that I'll do my best to make sure that they have a copy of that film. If there's anything I can assist them with, not monetarily, because you don't pay people to be in your films, but I try to develop a strong, trusting relationship with the people who are in the films, and to explain why I think it's important for them to be in the films, like why I think their stories matter. And in many cases, people will not think that their stories matter because we've been told as people of African descent that we don't matter, we don't count. So here's someone coming along saying, yes, you do count, and I believe that you count. And trust me, because I want to put, you know, your face in this film, in your story. And I must say that once that's happened, and I spend a lot of time before filming with the individuals or the organization, then I've developed that trust, and they've seen the other work that I've done. And I share that other work that I've done with them so that they can see, as transparent as I can be about what the work is, what I want to do, and why. Regarding the actual installations, it's been an interesting process working with the museum, the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. They hosted one of my iterations, and they allowed me to look into their archive, into their materials for what I could use. Similarly, when I went to the UNB Arts Center, King's Landing historical site allowed me to come there and dig through and rummage through their material and pull from their archive. The Royal Ontario Museum was a pretty interesting experience of going into their stacks and pulling out things and finding things that I could use. And so again, with all of these, it's been showing my previous work and telling people what it is I want to do and why. You know, that I'm curious, that I have these stories that I'm interested in, and you know that they, you know, that they can see what I've done before, and usually I've not had too many problems. Sometimes it's about having to do the 101, you know, Black History 101 with in some places, but in the main, it's really the key thing is trying to develop that initial relationship of trust so that people will understand what you're wanting to do and why, and that they will then support you and come aboard. And if nothing else, not to block you from doing what you want to do. I'm not sure if that fully answers the question that Solomon sent through.
Well, in the meantime, questions are literally pouring in, Sylvia. I have 7 in queue. The first one is from Sarah, who is first of all thanking you very much for your presentation. You referred to your artworks in terms of how they secure lives on their own. You must let go. In these descriptions, I had a sense of a mother having to let her children go. Later on, you also referred to the separate artworks, sometimes spanning decades, as siblings. Could you comment on the familial metaphors?
Yeah. Well, it's in terms of the siblings, for example, the Speaker from the Heart of Black Nova Scotia and the Little Black Schoolhouse are the most obvious siblings because they both focus on education in some way. And actually, Speak It arose out of the ashes of the fire that happened at the National Film Board. And initially, this longer project I was planning to do would have had, you know, maybe a short segment on education, but then once the fire happened, I was not able to do a full film. So I did Speak It, and then I still was interested in education and particularly segregated schools, because I went to one when I was young. My mother taught at one. And so I really wanted to find a way to bring those intergenerational, in fact, conversations together. And so Speak It and the Little Black Schoolhouse both deal with education. And within Speak It, there's actually a montage within that film. And in that montage, there are a lot of photographs that then find their way later on in my work. So there's a photograph of Portia White in Speak It in a montage. And so then I made the full film about Portia White. I believe Carrie Best is in that montage. And I've, in the last couple of years, did a project about Carrie Best. So it's almost as if, you know, I embed these things in my projects as reminders that there's stories that I want to tell. About, you know, as if they're children, not so much children as I think when I mentioned about the work doing its work, it's that you do a piece of work and then it's past you. Then the work is out there in the world, and I consider it, you know, the work, it's doing its work. It has to be out there without me, and so perhaps it is like a child being out in the world on its own. But it's kind of my way of thinking about all of these interconnections with the work that I do. And then again, the sort of missives, the notes, the letters that do come back to me from time to time of people who say, well, I saw Black Mother, Black Daughter, or I saw Speak It, or I read something that you wrote and it was very helpful to me. So that those kinds of reports back from the field, as I would call it, are really helpful and encouraging to me to keep going. So thank you for that question, Sarah. I hope that that answer helps.
Great. Again, that is just sudden flood of questions and very little time. So let me just kind of try to pick at them. I have a question from Katia, who asks, at the very beginning of your talk, you declared that telling our stories disrupts comfortable narratives. As an educator, how have you guided students in finding the courage to tell stories that confront narratives that are backed by great power?
Mm. Well, one of the, you know, there's different ways that I like to talk with students. I often think it's important for students to feel comfortable within their own skin, within their own bodies. And I think it's important within the classroom, particularly for the teachers to create an environment that will allow the students to feel comfortable. Because if the student doesn't feel comfortable with that teacher and how the teacher has created that environment, it's going to be difficult for them, even if they have a lot of courage, to be able to speak and to be able to tell their own truth. So first of all, I think it's a question of the adult, who's the adult in the room, and what is that adult doing to support and nurture the students who are there, so that they will feel that level of comfort to be bold, to use their imagination, and to speak about things that may be uncomfortable, and to challenge, you know, the colonial narrative. Because students, I've had students tell me that in both high school and university classes, they've had professors who will chat when they've challenged a professor about their particular comment about, you know, Black Canadian history or Asian Canadian history or something of that nature. And then if the professor or the pushes back on them, then that's very hurtful. That can be harmful, especially if it's not done in a loving way, in a way that allows that student to engage in the conversation. But if it's done as a way to shut the student down because perhaps the professor is uncomfortable, or because professor's knowledge is not as great as it should be, then that particular environment is not one conducive to learning, in my opinion, or to students having the courage to speak their truths.
Thank you. I'm just reflecting on what you've said in the context of, the end of term and students' stress and the need for support. Thank you so much. I'm just checking the time, but I do think we have time for questions. And this is regarding finding names in the context of something you talked about. The question is from Scott, who says that you mentioned the need to engage with violence against women. And recently the term has emerged and been popularized, the term femicide. And Scott asks whether this act of naming, or whether acts of naming as such can be a radical act. And do you sense that the current rise in femicidal violence globally is perhaps creating the conditions for recognizing the reality that this is truly horrific violence, and whether you perhaps see radical potential in the creation of shelter networks that help women flee domestic violence? Oh. Again, I think we would want to also relate it to your work. You spoke about your work as being a force of resistance to violence against women.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I quite got all of the essence of the question. I think, the term femicide is not really a new one. It may be more current right now, it may be being used a lot more right now, but it is not a new one. Matters of, violence against women and domestic violence have been with us for a long time. I think that male violence is something that I think males really do need to step up mostly, because what we're seeing often is the women who are both having to do the double work on that. So I think that if we're ever going to make even a dent in eradicating or lessening or whatever the kind of physical and emotional violence that women, Black women, women of all backgrounds face, then I think that males in our communities need to do some self-examination to figure out how they can begin talking to other males about it. It's not about, for example, telling girls that they should, put their skirt longer, or they shouldn't have done this and that. So the whole thing of women having to, control themselves. I mean, there's a lot of negative language out there about women and why a woman might have been abused in a situation. And often I think it's because that many of the males who are in position of power, who really could do something, haven't been doing anything, have really allowed mostly women to be, carrying this incredible burden. So, the prominent nature of some of the things that we've been seeing in the last number of weeks, perhaps it might be, Scott, maybe you are already engaged with your, with other males that to have study groups, to have conversations, to challenge that language that you might be hearing in, when you're in, with your buddies or out for a beer. These kinds of things have to stop, but there has to be, both sides dealing with this. And at this point, from what I've been able to see over many, many years, there's just not as much effort on the part of males to say, this is not right. We are going to do something about it. We are going to organize. We are going to intervene. So I may not have answered your question, but I do think that perhaps that's something to think about is where males are in this whole question of particularly male violence against women.
Thank you, Sylvia. just reminded of a book by Mary Warren that is entitled Femicide, and that book came out in 1984. So indeed, the term has been around, and it's wonderful that it is being recognized. Thank you. I think we should begin to conclude, and in conclusion, I have two questions about what next. One that is from Jason, who asks whether you've ever thought about doing a documentary about Melville Island, because it's such an incredible story and it seems rarely known. And if I may, I will combine it with a question from Sam, who also says hello, and says that I've mentioned to you in the past, I've learned more from your work as an artist than in all of my history classes in Nova Scotia. So sincere thank you for adding to our collective knowledge. And Sam's question is, what's next?
Thank you, Mai. Thank you for those wonderful comments. What's next? Melville Island, yeah, it is a preoccupation of mine. Whether I will do a project about it, a big project, a film project, a documentary, remains to be seen. Often I have kind of a grocery list of projects that I'm working on. So I'm not really sure, but it's definitely something that that does preoccupy me. I've been doing research about it, listening to the voices of the people who were there, reading a lot of the documentation related to it. So perhaps, I'm not sure, but perhaps. And thank you for the kind comments.
Great. I still have questions. I know our time is drawing to an end. Can I leave it to you, Sylvia, whether you would allow a couple more rather specific questions or?
Sure, yeah, a couple more, sure.
A couple more, and then we will definitely have to wrap up. I have a question from Evelyn, who is asking, I know you continue to work on Portia White, and Evelyn asks, what is she, that is Portia White, asking you to tell us about her?
Thank you. Well, what is she asking me? I wouldn't be so presumptuous to try to think my way back into Portia White's mind, to think about what she would want me to tell you. I know what I want to tell. I want to tell a lot more about her period of time that she lived in the United States. Her years in New York, and the people who were in her circle, people like Langston Hughes and Carl Van Vechten, who was this amazing photographer who photographed all the prime people from the Harlem Renaissance. I also want to explore more about her management, the management company that I think really did not treat her well from what I can see. And I've been doing some digging about that company and its practices. So I'm curious about why she didn't have a record produced during her time with the company. I'm curious about why she didn't get more concerts, and why the concerts she had were some of the smaller ones. She was on a roster with a lot of prominent people, within this management company. So I'm interested in that aspect of her life. What happened with the management? I'm also interested in just the selection of her repertoire, and how that came about, and why there were certain songs that she went back to time and time again. And then there are other aspects of her life that, I may never find out. Some of the friends that she had who are long gone, but I'm curious about those kinds of friendships.
Thank you. And I promise this will be the last one. And it is from Jason, who is also thanking you for this inspiring conversation. And Jason is asking, Sylvia, in your research, do you know if the Maroons' beliefs survived in Nova Scotia? History tells us John Wentworth wanted to Christianize them. But I would just add that obviously the Maroon history is important to you. Your film company is called Maroons Company. Maroons Film.
Yes, name for them, name for the Maroons.
Name, yeah.
Thank you for that question, Jason. I'm not aware specifically of whether any of the particular beliefs survive, because the majority of the Maroons were left to go to Sierra Leone. And there were, a few families that were left, but in the main, the majority of the Maroons left. And and I'm not the one to speak to this, but I know that the Colley family, there's a Colley family in the Preston area that has links to Governor Wentworth, because it's believed that Governor Wentworth had a relationship with a Black woman, free Black woman, who lived in Preston, because he had a farm or an establishment, a house there. So there is a Colley family in the greater Preston area that I believe has some links back to Governor Wentworth, and that person I believe may have been Maroon. But beyond that, I can't really say. Thank you, though.
Thank you, Sylvia. You've been most generous with answering this avalanche of questions. And what remains is to thank you so very much for being with us tonight, with the hope that we will be able to see you in person sooner rather than later, and looking forward to more of this wonderful, important work. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thanks everyone for taking part and for the amazing questions. And I do hope that I've, at least in some measure, been able to respond to them. Thank you again for participating, and thanks to the organizers for this amazing project on memory. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. That was wonderful. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us. See you at the next talk, May 5th. Have a great evening, everybody. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye. Good
Bye.
night. Bye, Saul. Hi, Saul.
Hi. That was.
To say hi.
Hi, Dorota. That was fantastic. We're going to pause this.